This year, we are making the award to ChemFORWARD and its company partners for its development of trustworthy databases, which are then disseminated to companies who use this information to transition the chemicals used in their products to other chemicals which are environmentally safer. We live in a world of thousands of chemicals. They are present in the clothes we wear, what we eat and drink, the furniture in our homes, and even in the health products that we buy. Thus, focusing on what society can do to ensure the protection of public health in this chemical-intense world is especially important. Before introducing the panel, let me thank the Roy family, and especially Steve, who's here today, for their generosity in making this award possible, and also this afternoon possible, so thank you. In the next hour, we're going to have a panel discussion about chemicals and the environment, chemicals in the environment, with a focus on the challenges and opportunities, and especially on the role of information-based initiatives, such as that put forward by ChemFORWARD. I will then, at the end, turn this over to Professor Gordon Hanson, who is our academic dean for strategy and engagement, to present the award on behalf of the school. So let me introduce our panel. Heather McKenney serves as the Science and Safer Chemistry Lead at ChemFORWARD, where she drives efforts to enhance access to ChemFORWARD's programs. She oversees the quality and integrity of data within ChemFORWARD's data trust and plays a key role in science communication. She began her career in the consumer packaged goods industry. She led the toxicology and product safety team for the Honest Company for 6 years. And in this role, she oversaw ingredients and product safety reviews. She holds a Master's of Public Health degree, concentrating in environmental health from Boston University School of Public Health, and a bachelor's in environment science from Purdue University. She resides in Los Angeles. David Bourne is the lead sustainability strategist for Google. He has a deep industry expertise in product design, user experience research, and circular economy innovations. He is a founding member of the consumer hardware sustainability team at Google. And prior to his current role, he was for over 12 years of experience at Apple and Nest Labs, now part of Google.
Thank you.
And he holds a graduate degree in sociology from Emory University. Charles Taylor is an assistant professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School. His research interests are in environmental economics with a focus on climate change, agriculture, land use, and ecosystem services. He often uses satellite data, remote sensing to answer policy questions. Prior to coming here, he spent several years at the Earth Partners LP, a sustainable land investment company, McKinsey Company, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And he is co-founder of the Drylands Natural Resource Center. He received his doctorate in sustainable development from Columbia University. So I'm going to begin by asking a few questions. We'll have a discussion and a conversation about chemicals and their regulation and various programs to reduce them. Then I'll turn this over to the audience for your questions. So I would like to begin by asking Heather, can you give us a quick overview of the purpose of ChemFORWARD, and what do you feel has been its success?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So before I jump into the introduction for ChemFORWARD, just because the purpose of this panel today is to celebrate collaborative initiatives to reduce chemical hazards, I want to acknowledge that I did come as a collaborator with ChemFORWARD in my previous role at the Honest Company. So I was using this data, helping to build the database actually in an applied manner. So it's just very exciting to be here today and see the scale at which we can start to talk across industry, but also with academia and policymakers alike. So ChemFORWARD is a nonprofit science-based value chain collaboration. And really our goal is to increase access to chemical hazard data. And ideally, we would like to reduce those chemicals of high hazard and then looking for alternatives instead. So long-term guiding philosophy that we follow at ChemFORWARD is the idea of no data, no market. However, we all know that that's not the case, not only in the United States, but worldwide. There's no requirement across all industries that all chemicals must be vetted before use. So one of the areas that we started in was this idea of material health. So our co-founder and executive director, Stacey Glass, who's here today, came at this work from her past at the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute, which is a certifier, among others, but a certifier of products. And when she was doing some of this research, she found that the material health assessment portion of the certification was the #1 thing that would send a well-intentioned company back to the drawing board, likely never to return for certification. And this was because there was one molecule, an impurity, something about a chemical hazard in their material that was inappropriate for certification. But many of us know who work in this space, there's tons of toxicology data out there. And how do we start to apply and share that information such that it's not just siloed in a REACH dossier in the EU or in an individual organization who's developed that data? So starting to think about models where we can share the data and also share the costs of that data was the impetus of ChemFORWARD. So Stacey worked with Dr. Lauren Hine, who was the co-author of Green Screen for Safer Chemicals, and also an early contributor to the to the US EPA Safer Choice Program, to start to think about what a data repository would need to look like so that we could start to solve this problem. Using early user-centered design with folks like Google, we were able to develop a platform that would help users answer these questions for themselves. I know maybe what not to use. I know what those high hazard chemicals are because they're regulated or because there's some industry knowledge of a concern. But what do I use instead? So at ChemFORWARD, we've developed a methodology that houses the chemical hazard assessments across 24 plus, and I say plus because it really depends on what we're looking at here, human and environmental health endpoints. So on the human side, we have things like carcinogenicity, the ability to cause cancer, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, but also skin irritation, eye irritation, neurotoxicity. In the environmental side, we have aquatic toxicity, persistence, et cetera. So looking at the totality of the data, which we do present in the data repository, which is cloud-based subscription model, you can look at the endpoints yourself. We then take the totality of the hazards and send an overall hazard classification score, which we call our hazard bands. And the hazard bands are on an A to F score, where A's, B's, and C's are generally considered safer, and D's and F's are not. And a question mark in the system is a chemical that's not been characterized. So there's not enough data publicly available, or there's not a chemical hazard assessment available to know something with high confidence about the hazards or the safety of that chemical. And working with companies such as Google and those that were ahead of the curve early on in the days of developing this system, we were able to find some of those high impact chemicals that we knew were being used. We knew they were of priority to the industry to know what those potential hazards might be or if it's safer. So starting to populate the repository with that data, we were able to build a baseline where then smaller organizations or organizations that were just earlier on in their chemical management journey could come and benefit from the repository that had already been built with some of those high impact chemicals. So we do believe that the shared data, cost sharing, benefit sharing. So if Google completes a CHA, company C comes in and they want access to that. Once they subscribe, they get access to all of the CHAs in the system. And that really is, from our perspective, one of the best bets to scale the access to safer chemistry, because we don't really have these strong policy mechanisms in place that require that the data be developed. Previously, this was really a duplicative cost and resource intensive process. So an individual chemical hazard assessment can cost up to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how difficult they are. So you can imagine if you've got thousands of chemicals in your repertoire, really challenging to know something about the hazards there. So by reducing the duplication of efforts and making it more cost effective, we can start to manage this chemicals issue. And so this is also really supported by some research that's come out. There is a framework called the planetary boundaries, which looks at it's a framework that looks at different variables. It's targeted at understanding the processes that are critical for maintaining the stability and the resilience of Earth systems as a whole. And so through this framework, the authors who published the 2023 update to planetary boundaries found that novel entities, piece of the pie, so there's several other variables that we think about, biodiversity, carbon, et cetera. The novel entities, safe operating space had been well surpassed. The safe operating space is where we want to be to ensure that we're not going to have long-term implications associated with that potential environmental concern. Well surpassed, and that was surpassed in part when annual production and release of novel entities outpaces the global capacity for assessment and monitoring. And so when we saw that in 2023, we realized, oh, we do think we're on the right track here, because it's not necessarily an individual chemicals problem, it's a systems problem to understand what chemicals are in commerce and what those hazards or concerns might be associated with them. So we can talk a little bit more about some of those successes, because I talked a lot here, but really our successes come along with our industry partnership and how we can apply that baseline data that I just talked about and start to make informed decisions at the industry level, but also working with policymakers to ensure that we're all working from a harmonized place of data.
Thank you. David, Google has the ability to pay for its own private toxicological assessments. Why did you decide to partner with ChemFORWARD?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's really the core question. The partnership with ChemFORWARD is really consistent with Google's mission. Right? Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And what we realized in the partnership with ChemFORWARD, every time we do a chemical hazard assessment, it's not just proprietary information for Google or for whoever did the assessment, that is now available to anyone who wants to subscribe to the platform. And so the scalability that creates in access to this hazard profile for thousands of chemicals is really what we saw as transformational. The analogy I like to give is to say, like, if you wanted to watch a great TV show and you had to pay a Hollywood studio to make a show just for you, it would cost you an absurd amount of money. But because they have lots of subscribers to a streaming platform, everyone can contribute and get access to a whole body of content that is valuable. And that's kind of the model that ChemFORWARD has developed with hazard assessments. And so doing all of our hazard assessments, of which we have done hundreds, through ChemFORWARD really creates that industry change that we think is a great value proposition.
Thank you. Charles, you've spent a lot of time in your life working on pesticides, which I guess we can call a form of toxic chemical. And could an information-based program like ChemFORWARD's have a role in pesticides, or is pesticides basically regulate or go home?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, stepping back a little bit for context here, right? The regulator's problem is really hard. You're introducing a new substance, whether it's an industrial chemical or a pesticide, and there's some clear economic demand for it, but like a really uncertain effect, right? Like you don't know what the potential consequences of it are. And I think anything that's an information disclosure, so like the EPA, for example, has this thing called the toxic release inventory, which requires all facilities that produce anything to pretty much say each year how much of whatever chemical they released. And it's one of these things where the regulator can't stay on top of the 80,000 chemicals that are currently out there. So this kind of information is really important to getting out to researchers and others who can kind of like be some of the guardians to assess, like, do we see chronic effects? Do we see these kind of downstream effects? So it's both hard in the uncertainty as well as the sheer manpower, womanpower of regulating these things, of to understanding to have the resources to do it. So anytime an entity comes together to do this, and particularly streamline information, I think is useful here. I guess I would say that, you know, the other thing that is hard in this setting where there's limits to what toxicological studies can do, right? So you think of this, there's a new chemical, you go to the lab, you know, you do either animal testing or cell assays and see kind of what happens to determine whether it's safe or not. That doesn't necessarily say anything about how it's actually going to be felt in humans, particularly over long-term chronic exposure to these things. So it's one form of risk, but there's kind of lots of these things that require kind of like pretty strong vigilance on these questions.
So let me stay with you for 1 second, and you know, you look at all of these toxic chemicals that are out there, and how we only really are able to regulate a few of them. I remember when the toxics part of the legislation passed years ago, and it was just overwhelming, the notion, the thought you could get to all of these. If you look at government programs, you've got the regulatory programs. You've got disclosure requirements. I think of things like nutrition. When I want to find about nutrition, it's all the labeling that's required. And then there are information programs, and ChemFORWARD is certainly one of those. EPA advisories. I was looking the other day, they've had hundreds of EPA advisories. We don't regulate, but we tell you this might be bad, so you want to know about this. When is it best to use one of these versus the other? And if going forward, you know, I know the Trump administration has talked about less regulation and more in terms of informing people, because chemicals have all of these qualities that improve our society, and we don't want to lose that benefit. What are your thoughts about sort of guidance if people are looking at the various instruments that are available to governments?
I guess I would veer on the side of the precautionary principle, where until something's been out there for a while, to, you know, like especially something novel, like, you know, kind of wait and see. I mean, for the example of pesticides, for example, right? They, over the last 75 years, a pesticide gets approved by the EPA, and then it, you know, it might be the first, second, third most used pesticide in the country. And this is, you know, millions and millions of tons that goes everywhere. And it's considered safe, and then 20 years later, it gets revoked and regulated because we find out it wasn't safe. That happened with DDT. That's pretty much happened with almost every class of pesticides. That was like the number one used that we used for all of our crops, and then it ends up getting regulated. And then the one that we replace it with, the safe replacement, 20 years later, that also gets regulated. So there's, how does one deal with that? I mean, information disclosures don't help all that much, and particularly, like, you take has anyone seen the labels in the state of California, where if you buy something, pretty much everything says like the state of California thinks this is carcinogenic content. Like, that's almost like overkill. Then you become insensitive to it, right? The consumer then just sees that on everything, and then they can't actually inform a behavior change or a smart consumption thing. So I think without, I mean, information disclosure is always going to be good, but without, you know, some resources or like kind of, you know, long-term reassessment of things that are out there and the precautionary principle, like you're always going to kind of be behind the 8 ball. And I think that's just like a really tough problem for policymakers to face.
David, you have some thoughts on this?
I do. I mean, I do think you're absolutely right. I mean, the notion of no news is good news when it relates to chemical hazard is one that is fundamentally a problem, right? You don't want to use something, assume it's fine, and then find out decades later that it's not. And so I think the notion of taking a very proactive approach to chemical use, to say, hey, we want to know this is good before it's in widespread use, as opposed to assuming it's fine because it hasn't been regulated yet. I think it's that's a shift I hope we see in all industries, really. But I do think it is the case that, you know, initially when something is brand new, there will be a lack of data, right? And I know and you can speak about this better than I can, but, you know, when you do a chemical hazard assessment, it is, you know, leveraging existing research, and if something that's brand new, that may not exist, or maybe be fair. So I think our understanding of chemical hazards will change over time But nonetheless, taking a proactive approach at the very outset is always a good idea.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So what I neglected to mention in talking about the hazard bands, the A's, B's, C, D, F, we also have a question mark hazard band. That represents an uncharacterized chemical, either because there's no data or because there's insufficient data to know if that chemical might be safer or hazardous. We also have a U hazard band. So that's a chemical that's undergone a full hazard assessment, but there were far too many data gaps in the endpoint. So we don't know anything about endocrine disruption, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity. You can't get a score. We can say at this point, we have no confidence that you can move forward with using this chemical in your product. So that's one way that we can start to think about it from a precautionary or even just health conservative perspective. But I think that there's something to be said for transparency, because oftentimes when we start to get into this categorization of what's in a product, we need to back so far, like how far back in the supply chain should we be going when we're talking about individual organization questions of what's in the table. So if the organization doesn't have access to that information, a policymaker certainly can't start to regulate the table if the manufacturer doesn't know what's in the table, right? So I think there's an opportunity to have enhanced transparency regulation to start to answer this question.
Let me drill down and continue on this, but I'm going to use a particular chemical category, which are these PFAS chemicals, which get a lot of publicity these days. I probably am wrong on my take, but I think the Stockholm Convention in 2002 directed the countries who signed this who were part of the convention to think seriously about regulating and reducing the use of PFAS chemicals. And yet 23 years later, and multiple EPA advisories, governments have done very little to regulate them. Although interesting, what I found was the issue is that large companies like DuPont, 3M, actually significantly reduced their use of PFAS chemicals. But the governments have been shied away from it simply because they don't seem to feel they have enough evidence to move. What is the story here? I mean, we had a session 2 years ago here where all the speakers unanimously thought we ought to do more on this. How do you determine that with all of the uncertainties around it? And yet we're 23 years into the convention, in which 153 countries all agreed they ought to do something, and I don't think any of them have.
Is that directed at me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I do, yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all regulatory inaction, but I will say that part of the complexity of PFAS
Is it regulatory inaction, or is this reasonable, caution?
Well, I think one complexity around PFAS is the size of the category, right? This is a category with tens of thousands of chemicals.
Yep.
And so to have a blanket judgment on all of them together it would be difficult to say, I think. But actually, I mean, the category goes back long before. I think they were invented in the 40s or 50s even. So it's been a long time. I think one thing that does happen in industry is the benefits of a chemical are very apparent. That's why they get invented, is because they have particular mechanical or physical properties that are beneficial for a product. And so they get used. And I think it's hard then to let that go, right? And so I think if the materials become embedded into commercial purposes and meant for become embedded in product value propositions and become embedded in the economy, I think that creates a challenge for regulators to say, hey, are we really going to yank that value away? But nonetheless, I do think it is a combination of data about how hazardous something is that we accumulate over time, awareness of alternatives that can perform just as well that has to be developed over time, and then the long process of regulatory action following that. But if something can speed that up a lot more, I think is going to be a good thing.
Charles, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add that there's also a challenge with the definition of what is a PFAS that a lot of the folks have trouble with. It depends on who you ask. What is the definition of a PFAS? If you ask an NGO, they might say any carbon fluoride bond, call it a PFAS. but that's not necessarily aligned with what the EPA or the OECD thinks is PFAS. So one of the things we've tried at ChemFORWARD is to help through our partnerships, develop tools that can help at least at that screening level. Should I even be concerned about this molecule or not? And actually last week, we launched a tool called PFAS ID that both based on the known lists of PFAS and a structural identifier, we can flag to a user, there might be reason for concern. But one of the biggest challenges we heard is manufacturers didn't know if they were working with PFAS in the first place.
PFAS is, I don't have much, knowledge on PFAS in general, but kind of my framework of looking at it is just, what is the, it might have an economic benefit, but like, what is the cost of like using a known alternative, right? Kind of the substitution idea. And if there's an increasing range of uncertainty about like some of the damages that this can have, and there's like the next best alternative isn't all that much less productive or beneficial or costly, it seems like we should incentivize firms to do that and figure out how to do that. And like if that's really hard to do in the regulatory way, like the kind of another interesting way that is used is through litigation and the legal system of like, if there's a known, if it's a known or an unknown, even like damages or like health issues that can be created by the product that you're selling, and it like kind of increasingly becomes apparent over time, right? And you set yourself up for lawsuits, right? Like that can also incentivize changes in firm behavior, right? Like we've seen that a bit on the pesticide side, and it's been somewhat effective in kind of pushing companies to figure out these questions, to figure out what is being used and find alternatives, and then make that assessment. Like, sure, if there's no pressure getting put on them, there's no incentive to find a substitute. But if there's a relatively benign substitute that isn't that much more costly, it seems like that's a win-win, particularly on these like big uncertain ones where like more and more like yellow to red flags in the scientific community are coming up about like potential risks.
I guess one of the issues that when I look at sort of the history of this, and I mentioned 3M, DuPont, in the case of PFAS, and I look at the members and your partners, a lot of them are very well-to-do companies. Nike, Google, Apple, Sephora, and that they will tend, even with advisories, to say, oh, we have reputational risk and we have liability. But what about the middle size, those smaller companies that don't have this? I mean, we've been talking a lot among ourselves here about methane regulation, which I realize is different. But again, the big guys are more than happy to regulate it. It's the little guys and the middle-sized guys that don't. So how do you reach them? Because your organization, there are a lot of people with deep pockets. What do you do with the people with small pockets?
I think the first thing we do is we keep building the database so that when those folks come in and subscribe and get access to the data, there's even more chemicals that have been characterized so they can start to see even bigger potential value proposition, not only for formulating new products, but formulating old products. So if there's then a regulation that comes through that says you can no longer use PFAS, then the questions would be, what do we use instead? And so the way that we're building the system is such that it's not only safer chemicals, but it's safer functional alternatives. So building it in such a way that it can be used to answer these questions that the mid-size and the smaller size companies are going to have. Building in criteria like, what is the function? What is the application? What is the VOC content? What is the pH? Is this a preservative? What kind of bug does it work against? Like, we need to understand the use cases. And we work closely with the partners, the folks who tend to have the deeper pockets, ask those questions, build it correctly, and then more folks can come in and start using it at the right price with the right.
But can I get access to your information without joining and paying a subscription fee?
Right now, we are subscription based, and that is in part because of our business model. So we work with qualified toxicology firms who own and maintain the data. And it's really critical that I'm not going in and just, David calls me and says, hey, what's the hazard of this chemical? We're going to third parties who are independent. They have their own liability insurance, their own reputations to uphold. And then we go through a peer review process with an independent toxicologist who reviews every endpoint and all of that data. So it's really important that we are compensating them for their data. And to do that, we do need to have a sustainable business model that we can successful for their work.
Sort of points you towards
It is a
regulation.
hard, I mean, it puts the, you know, the, you'd say like the real third party, you know, you'd say, you know, scientists or researchers who don't have a stake in this at all, who are truly disinterested, at a disadvantage because like that information isn't available. So, you know, finding a way to somehow make that available, you know, would be great. I don't know if you can do that within your business model, but it's also, I mean, you know, the EPA like it does regulate, like, or at least like requires every new chemical to be listed. So I'm kind of curious like what the overlap of kind of your list of chemicals and the, you know, 80,000 chemicals under, you know, EPA regulation are, because one of the challenges I just before this says, just to kind of play around with it, I downloaded the list of chemicals that, you know, if you're going to introduce or use in a commercial way, you have to get, you know, some level of approval or authorization from the EPA to do it, and including some toxicology reports. And I think there was only 16,000 of the 80,000 were listed because those were the ones that were considered non-confidential. So it's like, as a researcher or a third party, like it becomes really hard to kind of try as civil society to try to like understand what's going on here and like, you know, to think about like what's in the consumer and health welfare of you know, these regulations.
Yeah, and to answer your question, the database that we built was really important. A lot of people want to know how much is in the database. And I think that the right question is, do we have the right stuff in the database? So we could have pulled in all of the millions of chemical cast numbers that might exist and pull in even chemicals that haven't been made yet, but they in theory could, and they've been assigned a cast number. So when we designed the platform, we ensured that all of the chemicals we were gathering were chemicals known to be in commerce. So just start with the right data set. So we would have all of those 80,000 chemicals in ChemFORWARD. I don't know that all of them would have a hazard band, but my assumption if they're regulated at the EPA level is likely there's enough public data available that we've assigned a confident hazard band to them. It's probably not an A, B, or C if it's restricted at the EPA level. It's probably on those potentially hazardous side of things.
I'm going to open this up in a minute to all of you, so think of your questions. But I would like to, you know, as somebody who doesn't spend a lot of time on these issues, the thing that I've always struck with sometimes thinking about this is the role of values in science. For example, I could be a lot more risk averse than you, and therefore, you know, the concern over a chemical, or I could say, well, it does all these beneficial things. So I don't really think, even if it has a few dangerous aspects to it, maybe we should not really think about. I don't think we should regulate it. Or I could say that another would be, I'm very conservative. I want to have a zillion tests before I am going to be willing to regulate or tell people. And then you could say, no, I think we've done enough tests. We've got a pretty good sign using the precautionary principle. We ought to regulate this, or we want to put it off the market. What's the role of values in these decisions? And how do you sort of find some middle ground that sort of meets this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the ways that we try to tackle this is all of the chemical hazard assessments in the repository are based on the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling, or GHS. So that is a harmonized language that's used worldwide. It was developed by people who had value judgments when it was developed, but it is based on a harmonized approach so that when you look at chemical A and chemical B, they were assessed under the same methodology. So at least we're comparing apples to apples in that way. But I'll let.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, there's always a range of conservative or, you know, risk averse, you know, positions you can take. I do think that any position you take has to have some data to base it on, though. And I think what we're seeing is in our effort to both understand all of the materials that are in our products and understand the hazard profile of all of them, what we're seeing is there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of materials and chemicals out there of which nothing is been assessed. And so that's the path we're going down, is to let's have an initial assessment, understood, by which we can make a decision. I'm sure that assessment may change over time, but let's at least have a baseline to make some decisions from, for the majority of the materials that get used, which aren't subject to regulation today.
But to some extent, isn't it true, though, that when I buy a computer or I take my phone, there's efforts to make it so it doesn't catch on fire. There's efforts to make it so it stays clean, and there's chemicals being used. I don't have a clue what's in it. I just know it's a phone and I turned it on, or it's a computer, and anybody who's ever worked with me knows how much I know about how computers work. So I'm leaving that to you and Apple and companies like this to make those decisions for me. And so you make the value judgment of what I probably ought to want, don't you?
Indeed, yeah. And I mean, some of those material decisions actually get made deep into the supply chain as well. For as many engineers as Google or any other tech company has that's working on designing products, there's many more engineers in the supply chain that also contributes to those decisions, sometimes in ways that are invisible to the brand that's on the product. So in the case of chemicals, you're getting down to the most fundamental level. So like we may have electrical engineers that design the layout of the circuit board and design which components, choose which components are going to go into the smartphone. But in terms of the chemical profile, that's almost the most fundamental layer of any product. And a lot of times those decisions go deep into the supply chain. Maybe we've engineered certain parts of the materials, but not all of them. And so that's why we and other companies like Apple and so on have what's called a full material disclosure program, where we require suppliers deep into the supply chain to tell us what is in the product, because we may not have always been the ones to engineer those materials into it.
That means that you can tell me what's in this table.
If that was our product, yes.
Okay. Charles?
It's a fascinating question about values. And I mean, I don't think that, the place of like, I would be hesitant to like put that on, the values of companies would be to, regulate themselves to create safe products, right? I mean, I see that more as the role of regulation and the role of third parties, but you think of you as a consumer as well, right? Like acting on your values requires information. So I think of things like, and like when, PFAS became a concern and a lot of people wanted to stop using their nonstick pans, right? But like, they would have never known to do that if they were really concerned about it. They wouldn't do that until that information was available. And that information being available is both kind of a factor of like, is it out there? Is it clear? And also like, do people understand it, right? And there could also be kind of like educational gaps or like other, things that are correlated with those types of kind of what we call as an economist an information asymmetry about like, you can't make an informed, decision about consuming the product because you don't fully understand the risks or the cost. And those types of products will then disproportionately fall on the poor. So I think values are important from a consumer standpoint, and the more information, the better, but like still like the importance of regulation and like kind of putting some cost to companies, to ensure that they're incentivized to ask these questions and innovate is equally, if not more important.
Well, you take the pan, for example, the non-stick pan, is that, all I know initially is, well, that's great. I'm not going to have to spend all day washing this thing. And I look at the benefits. So somebody has to have said back when it's somewhere in the supply chain that, well, we're, going to provide a benefit, but there are some costs to this, like everything has benefits and costs. So basically we have to trust either the entities in the supply chain or B, the government to intervene on our behalf because of this information asymmetry that we just don't know what goes into these non-stick pans. And yet the government, so our system relies heavily on these choices, doesn't it? That are being made every day for us.
And they're very real. I mean, I've three little kids and, you know, like, is there lead in the paint in my house, right? Like, do I want to know that? Because then do I want to like have to replace that, repaint that? Or like, we have asbestos tiles on the out, exterior of the house. So there's like every day people are always navigating that, there's a cost to avoiding exposure to these potential risks, and, and that is hard, and it's real, right? Like that non-stick pans are very convenient,
So at this stage, I'd like to open it up. To our questions, Bill?
So that was great. I'm a super fan of this stuff. I've read the whole book. You guys are great. I have a question about what comes between bringing together the data and making it accessible, and people, entities, whether it's a town or a company or a manufacturing company or whatever, able to make a decision. And what I want to do is ask how you solved the problem that just derailed us for decades in the climate area, when we went very heavily into trying to provide data about climate change, climate variability, forecast climate changes, and so on, even to the extent of what difference would it make for rainfall or water storage in reservoirs and so on. Huge investment in getting that data and making it publicly available and accessible, more or less accessible. Help from Google. Take help from Google eventually. What we discovered was that only the wealthiest and most analytically focused communities or firms or states could make any use of that, because the decisions they had to make required combining, and this is comments that have been across the board here, combining the sort of basic data on here's what the climate is doing and how it might change with all sorts of other stuff. And that wasn't even particularly rocket science combining, but they just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. And if they did have the bandwidth to do it in one context, handling big sets of climate data wasn't there. So probably 15 years later than we should have, we found we needed to invest in intermediary organizations, decision support centers, originally funded by the government, now increasingly done by consultancies, that would perform the bridge between the decision the community was trying to make on what kind of carpets to buy for its new town hall and the utterly valuable data sets that had been created, sorry, not what kind of carpets to buy, what to do about your reservoir size or how high you would build levees, whatever it was, where we would position the next new road. We needed that in-between analytic capacity, and I'll defer to Charles on this, but I think we discovered the same thing in early use of bringing new agricultural data to farmers, that just creating it was a necessary first step, but without the extension type services for the thing you spent a lot of your time building, it sat there as a data set used by only the rich and privileged and already highly analytical groups. So how have you solved that problem? Not how have you addressed that problem?
Well, I don't have a solution today, but I don't think anybody has a solution today, but one of the models that I think is really interesting, because we are focused really on the chemical hazard. And we know that companies, even regulators, are not just making decisions based on hazards. All of these other considerations, it needs to work. We also don't want it to be too water intensive, carbon. There's so many additional pieces when we start to think about sustainable choices and functional alternatives that it can't just be hazard. So alternatives assessment is a framework that we can start to look at that is fairly well established, that starts to look at, you have a chemical of concern that does X, Y, Z, and it needs these parameters. Now we can look at the universe of potential alternatives and see if any of those alternatives actually could be feasible in the application that we're looking for. And there are some state regulations that are alternatives assessment based the California Safer Consumer Products Program through DTSC is. So if there were, if it moved on to that step of organizations required to move on to an alternatives assessment, then they would submit the results of their alternatives assessment to DTSC. So the state of California would have visibility to that information, and I'm not sure how many have been completed. I'm not sure in which industries they've been completed. But I think that they're also now facing that challenge of scaling, right? You're telling an organization you need to do an alternatives assessment. The big guys are going to go to the really technical firms who know how to do it, and they've got all this really high-powered ability to bring in all those pieces of information. Might be a better alternatives assessment than a smaller organization can afford. And so there are efforts that are happening right now to start to bring together technical experts to define what an alternatives assessment framework needs to look like. There's one that's launching this year, and I'm participating in it. So we're having our first meeting on Friday, so I can follow up with you after Friday. But we are trying to solve that issue on the chemical hazard side as well.
In this state, your issue, I think, was addressed by State University, so University of Massachusetts at Lowell, built what is today this Toxic Use Reduction Institute, but basically a publicly funded entity bridging between the EPA and other sources of the basic data. And the decision needs, especially like small manufacturers that couldn't build a big Google-sized shop of their own. And so it's almost a question of, do you have an active advocacy to help states or other entities argue for the existence of such things that would turn this semi-private good of yours into a public good?
We don't as of right now, but the UMass Lowell folks are the folks who are running that technical committee that I just mentioned. So we are participating. I
didn't know that.
Personally participating. Yeah, to try to move that forward.
Thank you.
Charles, do you have any comment on that?
No, I think that's spot on. Some information, the information's really hard for people to act on, especially big information. So finding ways to either distill it down or disseminate it through partners is crucial.
I'll add one comment to that, which is that, coming from the perspective of a product company, a million decisions to get made in a product when it's being developed. And those decisions get made by product managers, engineers, and designers who have tools, right? They use CAD tools, they have all sorts of tools to help them make decision-making and based on product performance or product weight or product cost or cosmetic, all sorts of decisions. And I think that there's a lot of untapped value in simply integrating these sustainability dimensions into those same tools. Like I've seen examples where there's CAD software which will help you calculate the carbon footprint of the part you're designing so that in real time you can understand that this aluminum part in this shape has a different carbon footprint than a different material part in a different shape. And I think safer chemistry is just one additional dimension that if you really plug it into the tools that companies and individuals use to design and make products at a technical level, you can really have a lot of impact there. That doesn't have to, that's not to say there isn't also a lot of policy, work that has to be done in a lot of other dimensions, but really bringing the data that is still being built in many ways to bear in the moment when things are getting designed and created is really an untapped potential, improvement source.
Thank you. Back.
Hi, my name is David. I'm a student here. I love this product. I think it's an amazing idea, and I think it's something that's needed. You mentioned that it's kind of filling a policy gap around sort of like data disclosure. So I'm wondering, like hypothetically, like 5 or 10 years from now, the government maybe catches on and is like, "This is a great idea. We want to do this." I guess like has your organization thought about that? It's hypothetical.
Basic classes at the back of the room always said we should be working our way out of a job. Like once we don't have jobs, we've succeeded. So right now we're building the repository. We hope for that. We really do hope, because it's based on the GHS-based methodologies, it can be applied, right? That we're already using these methods. So we really do hope that that's the future.
Excuse me, I'm Chris Russell. I would like you to put the numbers in perspective. I had an opportunity to talk with some of the ChemFORWARD folks just before this started. And they said that there were 220,000 chemicals known to be used in commerce, and they had been able to assign a hazard base to almost 25,000 of those 220,000 into these safer ones and less safe. So two questions, or maybe many, but of the 25,000 that are in the hazard base, is there a relative ratio of the ones that are the ABC safer category versus the DF eliminate or avoid category?
What I'll say is, and this is a quote from our other co-founder, Dr. Lauren Hine, toxic is easy, safe is hard. So it takes a lot more to say that something is inherently benign than it does to say that it's hazardous. So there are a significant number of Ds and Fs in the repository because based on the one endpoint, we know that the European Union has classified this chemical as a category 1 carcinogen, a known human carcinogen. Do I care if it's an eye irritant at that level? No, I can call that an F. So we are able to throw more Ds and Fs in the system than A's, B's, and C's, but we are growing those A's, B's, and C's as we start to see companies moving away.
So what's the relative ratio of those, if not an exact number?
I don't know off of the top of my head.
And are the hazards predominantly in, say, human health hazards, or are they environmental hazards, or both? Is there some way to, there are very different kinds of problems, although they sometimes meet when we're exposed to environmental hazards.
I don't know a ratio for that one either, but I will say that based on the way that data is typically restricted, we do see, or sorry, not data, chemicals are typically restricted based on human health hazards or an environmental plus a human health hazard. So you won't typically see an aquatic toxicant that's restricted in Europe unless it's persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So it could be toxic to the aquatic environment, but it could be also toxic to humans. So it's sometimes challenging to know with that designation of PBT, is it environmental, is it human? We do see a large number of chemicals that are restricted because of those human health endpoints, like cancer causing, reproductive toxicants. All of California Proposition 65 is reproductive and developmental and carcinogens. So you can imagine that that large list really can contribute about what we know or could know about a list of chemicals. So I would suspect human health is probably more driving.
Just one follow-up. Charles, you said something about 80,000. So what were those 80,000 chemicals?
That is the number I saw quoted that the EPA has of their kind of proposed or introduced chemicals as part of the Toxic Substances Control Act. So I'm not sure if that's a subset of what you're talking about.
Yeah, so there are rules with TSCA disclosures that I'm not an expert in, but I know that there are certain industries that are not required to meet TSCA requirements of beauty and personal care, for example, might not need to list a chemical on TSCA if there's not an environmental release.
Yeah, and maybe that's triggered the what. So yeah, cosmetics, for example, I think are a large part of or a part of your program are not included in that, and then pesticides are included in a different one. So it might just be kind of a categorization of which regulation regulates what type of chemical use.
But are these 80,000 ones of concern, or how do they relate to these other numbers?
No, those are just ones that are being used and kind of, have some level, have had to have a report, some sort of toxicology report, provided to EPA, and EPA has kind of marked them down as like, this is one of the chemicals being used. But I at least to the public and the non-confidential information that's available, I wasn't able to see any information on the, toxicity or the results of those.
Tom Mahoney from the Harvard School of Public Health. Question on pesticides, which has come up a couple of times in your remarks. And understanding that chemical pesticides as a class are avowedly one with long-term environmental and human health consequences, including but not limited to their persistence and so forth. The DDT was mentioned as an example. Just this week, Bayer's Monsanto unit lost another major case in its continuing litigation around Roundup glyphosate. Has the consortium looked at the relative costs and benefits, so to speak, human health in particular, and animal health, substituting biological methods of pest control for chemical, or is that beyond your remit? You'd have to partner with another organization to assess those transitions.
We would have to partner with another organization, but if we had the chemical hazard data, we would be advocating to take a hazard first approach, right? If we've got something that's an F and a C, we might want to prioritize getting more information on that C because that's emerging as a potential safer alternative. Where I think it gets sticky is we've got 7 carcinogenic pesticides. How do you pick which one's better? And we're not necessarily poised to make those decisions for all of the additional variables that need to influence that decision.
Sure. I mean, pesticides are easier in the extent that the number of them that are used at scale are in the hundreds, maybe, but harder that they're used at such a large scale and have so much, potential bioaccumulation, other risks that I think that's if I were to prioritize where more kind of research and information sharing should take place, that would be my priority. I mean, glyphosate is the most used herbicide, but there's plenty of other pesticides of the top 5, 10 or so insecticides that are currently being used in the US. I think at least half of them are banned or restricted heavily in Europe. So just even some level of information sharing or updating beliefs is I think important, but hard. And substitution with biological methods of pest control. I think a lot of innovation has happened as the organic industry has increased, right? These are farmers who are innovating to find biological substitutes for this and actually look at the kind of yield gap in the of an organic production to non-organic, and it's getting up there in terms of the productivity, narrowing the productivity gap. So they're figuring something out.
Amanda?
Question for Heather. You mentioned your new PFAS ID tool, and is that distinct from the ChemFORWARD platform? Is it a standalone?
Yes, it's freely available. It is distinct. So anybody can go in there, sign up for access, and search a chemical based on the CAS number, chemical name, and those results will come.
And did that arise from a particular need from any groups
Yeah, it was actually part of
policymakers, the public, that increased attention on PFAS, increased questions around how to regulate it?
Definitely, and it was a part of a bigger project that we were actually partnering with IBM through an NSF-funded grant to do a lot of work on PFAS. So it's part of a project called PFACS. And the first step, if we start to ask the question of which PFAS molecules should we be avoiding, how should we avoid them, how can we fill some of these knowledge gaps? When we talk about a chemical class-based regulation, to David's point, there might be a safer PFAS in there, but we don't have the data available. So how can we use some of this big data? How can we use some of these models that are being developed to start to separate potentially safer that should then go through a full chemical hazard assessment from those that we don't want to invest further in? So that's what the PFACS project eventually will get to. But to answer the first question, we realized we had to build this tool.
Okay.
And this is maybe a bit of a personal question. So the longer you work in this environment, do you change your behavior? Do you own a non-stick pan, or do you only eat organic?
I do not own a non-stick pan. I will say, so when I was in the beauty and personal care space, I was reading product labels all the time. I would go, if I had to buy a new lotion, I was reading every chemical on the back of the label. I was fatigued, and I was a toxicologist working in product safety, making those products. And so I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I need to find organizations that are transparent about their process and that I trust what they're doing is meeting my standard of care for myself. So I've really started to then put my dollars into organizations that are transparent and they meet my standard, right? Instead of having to go read those product labels every time I purchase something. So I have my handful of places that I'll go.
Yeah, well, I've been on this journey, as you know, as well, where I, took out every single can, bottle, everything from my cabinet, vanity, et cetera, to look at every single chemical and look them all up and come forward. But it is exhausting, right? And it is a level of diligence that's hard for a consumer to sustain, impossible.
And it shouldn't be the consumer's job.
And it
That's my
shouldn't, yeah.
opinion. I don't think consumers should have to do this at all.
Yeah, but I do, I agree with you said that that you do sort of start to get a sense for like, okay, this brand generally seems to do a better job than this brand. And hopefully regulation sets a new higher floor as well of a standard there, but yes, I've been down that rat hole before.
What about pesticides?
Yeah, very, very briefly, I mean, as I was writing my dissertation, which is about insecticides and infant mortality, that uses the 17-year emergence of cicadas as a way to kind of try to get at causal effects of it. My wife was pregnant, and so I was finding all these big effects of like infant mortality on exposure to this certain type of pesticide in these certain areas. So it's like whenever we go driving and, farm in Virginia, and like I know exactly like this crop, this pesticide's used at this rate. It's just like, all right, so like hold your breath as we're passing this, and then we come here, and then like don't drink the water here, and yeah, you gotta drive crazy. But you gotta live, right? I mean, it's all about relative risk, and in the scheme of things, like you're exposed to so many chemicals, right? Like I don't know how much you can do as an individual, and that's where I'm saying again, kind of beating the drum, like there is a it's regulations kind of getting beat up these days, but like there is an important role for that takes the onus away from the consumer, which particularly like only really like the really educated rich consumers can really use that information anyway, as we've seen. So you can drive yourself crazy.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's been great. Given that this is an award partnership, I'd love to hear a little bit about what were the hardest parts at the early stages of making this partnership. And maybe just my gloss on it is typically private sector doesn't love to be regulated. Some do, some don't. I often, looking at what's come out about PFAS and 3M, maybe they've moved away from PFAS fearing future litigation. So sort of the power angle and who would want this kind of database, and have there been people that have pushed back against what you're doing? What's made this easy and what's made it really hard?
It's a good question. I'll caveat, I've only been with ChemFORWARD for 2 years. So there's quite a few years that if you've got questions at the end, Stacey Glass can help you with from the early pains there. But one of the biggest challenges I've seen, because I'm more on the science side of things, is the acceptance that a hazard-based approach or hazard-first approach is appropriate. Because we're working with industries who have developed tools that have potentially explained away all the hazards. Right? And sometimes it might be valid, right? If something's a carcinogen via inhalation and it is it's a chair and you're not going to inhale the chair, that example if it's off gassing, but you get the point. Sure, maybe we're not concerned about that. But then you start to think about like the risk-based approaches that are thresholds, and well, at a certain level, we're not concerned about this because in this study, we had a threshold for cancer and all of that, that's okay. And that is really the industry standard. So helping to bring people to understand that when you use a hazard-based approach, you're not only protecting your consumer, you're protecting your consumer from cumulative exposure that they're not thinking about across all of their products, but also the entire life cycle. So your occupational health, you don't have to worry as much about PPE if you're using these safer chemicals. End of life, we don't have to worry about the recyclability of a plastic and all of those additives are already safer. So trying to find those angles to help them understand it's much bigger than just telling your consumer it's safe has been a helpful lever.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, I think, you can mitigate hazards, but it's rarely foolproof. And there's a whole life cycle, as you just said, to account for. So, if you can start with inherent hazard and minimize the surface area of inherent hazard, there's a lot less risk that you'd have to mitigate thereafter. So I think that is definitely an approach I see. I mean, I think in the end, and then into the future, I actually hope that adopting an inherent hazard-based approach with viable alternatives that are safer will actually make products simpler to manufacture. I mean, when you have to have a lot of environmental controls in manufacturing to protect, supply chain workers, et cetera, there's a cost to that, right? And an inefficiency to that. And so, and if you have to have really, sophisticated end-of-life recycling technologies to avoid hazards, that's also a drain on the circular economy as well. So I feel like we may find long-term that a hazard-first approach is actually a really efficient approach.
All right, one more, and then we have to go to the actual award. So, yes.
Sorry. So as an educator, and I see a lot of high school students who are eager to contribute to environmental initiatives, but struggle to find opportunities. So my question is like, do you see a role for high school students to contribute, whether in your research or your work from NGO or as businesses or as, higher education? What kind of role can high school students play in this area? Thank you.
Have you heard of the organization Beyond Benign? Okay, so this is an organization that works with educators, K through higher ed, that helps to teach institutions how they can teach green chemistry. Because typically, I don't know about everybody in this room, but I wasn't taught green chemistry when I took chemistry. I was taught chemistry. I wasn't taught these principles of the fact that we shouldn't be adding chemicals of high concern. We should think about the amount of material that's going into that product. So I think there's 12 principles of green chemistry, and Beyond Benign is, it's an NGO that works to put together educational resources and connect folks who are working in this space. And we last year worked with them to develop a module of how ChemFORWARD can end up in classrooms in college, at the college level, but I do think it's something that we could potentially bring into high school. I don't think that it would be appropriate at a younger age, but there is opportunity to start just thinking about it from the get-go, so that as they progress in their careers, they can start to think what the future might look like in a green chemistry, toxicology, safer formulation career.
So with that, I want to thank the panel for a terrific conversation on a topic that I'm sure we can be talking about for many years to come. So thank you very much. Stage, I'd like to invite Professor Gordon Hanson on behalf of the school to come up and make the awards.
Great. I'm gonna be official and be at the podium because this is gonna make it easier to do the handoff to you all. Great to see everybody this afternoon. I'm Gordon Hanson. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School, and I'm the academic dean for strategy and engagement. It's an honor to be here with you to celebrate innovation and leadership and environmental stewardship, which you guys have been talking about all afternoon, and to recognize the outstanding contributions of ChemFORWARD, the recipient of the 11th Roy Family Award for Environmental Partnership, to mark the 25th anniversary of this prestigious award. So this is something the Kennedy School does every 2 years to gather, to have the privilege of presenting this award for cross-sector partnership that demonstrates unique and creative approaches to protecting the environment. And by so doing, helps inspire governments, business, and organizations around the world to push the boundaries of creativity and to take risks that lead to transformative change. We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Roy family for their support and for making this award possible. The importance of innovation is particularly evident when we think about chemical regulation in the United States and the back and forth movements that we've had between presidential administrations over the last several decades, even when it comes to the regulation of hazardous chemicals. Sometimes those that have been shown to cause substantial harm. We've got evidence, we've got advocacy, and even with the valiant work of the environmental community, the path to a robust regulation has been fraught with obstacles. So that's why the work of ChemFORWARD is so crucial and deserving of recognition by providing companies, as you guys have been talking about, with these great, affordable, efficient tools to make informed decisions. ChemFORWARD has taken a step forward, a substantial step forward toward mitigating chemical hazards in a way that complements existing regulatory initiatives. It's a forward-thinking approach that equips industries to take proactive action, has this incentive compatibility that we like to teach our students is important when thinking about policy making and implementation. And so tonight, we're here to celebrate the achievements of ChemFORWARD, but also the spirit of innovation and collaboration that makes initiatives like this possible. ChemFORWARD exemplifies how we can transcend traditional boundaries, think creatively, and work together to create a healthier and more sustainable future. Once again, we extend our deepest gratitude to the Roy family for their support, and we congratulate ChemFORWARD on this well-deserved honor. Thank you very much.